Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's edition of Coffee with Craig. It's always a delight. Sometimes you're not the first duo that I've had. I've had other duos, but it's always a pleasure to get two for the price of one on Coffee with Craig. And today we're here on the occasion of the 25th anniversary of the Edna Bennett Pierce Prevention Research Center, and there's been a two-day
25th anniversary, yeah.
Of celebration, but a lot of hard work today, strategic planning, launching an initiative for the forward-looking vision of the center. And we are delighted to have with us the founding director and the emeritus C. Eugene Bennett Chair of Prevention Science, Mark Greenberg,
Yeah.
and the current director of the center and the current holder of the Bennett Chair, Max Crowley. So I will in a second, I'll do a little bit more formal introductions of Mark and Max, but I want to remind you that you can participate in today's session. You can use the Q&A feature, which is probably hovering somewhere at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and you can click on that and submit some questions. We had a few questions come in advance, and I've had a look at those, and I've got a list of questions here on my trusty clipboard that I'll throw at Mark and Max in a few minutes. But if things come up, or if you didn't have a chance to submit in advance, just go ahead, throw it in the Q&A, and we'll monitor those and work them into the conversation. Sound good? All right.
Yeah.
Well, let me go through the bona fides here. Let me start with Mark. So Mark got his PhD in psychology from the University of Virginia. And, I'm just not going to mince any words. He's one of the most accomplished academic psychologists in the world. Along with authoring and editing multiple books, he has more than 350 journal articles to his credit. His citation count is over 90,000. You're gonna get across 100. Do we have a clock on when you're gonna cross 100,000, Mark? And he's also authored and edited multiple books, as I think I already mentioned. He's received more awards than I can mention, including several Lifetime Achievement Awards from most prestigious professional societies in his field. Before coming to Penn State, Mark was on faculty at University of Washington for a couple of decades. His longstanding interest has been in the development of well-being and prevention interventions for children and families. Although he's retired from Penn State, we know he's still quite active professionally. And I noted somewhere that you're involved in a consultation with the government of Bhutan. Is that still ongoing?
Maybe.
Maybe. And that project is really looking at implementing a national school-based happiness well-being initiative. Maybe we'll talk a little bit more about that. But Mark, thanks for coming back for the celebration. Thanks for being here on Coffee with Craig.
Sure. Always great to be at Penn State.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks. Now, Max got his PhD in human development and family studies here at Penn State. His supervising professor was none other than Mark Greenberg. So we have a little legacy situation going on here. Max is nationally and internationally recognized as a leader in the field of prevention science. His work has been funded by several of the National Institutes of Health and many of the leading national foundations in this space, including names you've all heard of: the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, the Annie and Casey Foundation, and the Doris Duke Charitable Trust. He's been an elected member of the boards of the National Prevention Science Coalition and the Society for Prevention Research. And from that society, he's received both an Early Career Award and a Public Service Award. He characterizes his own scholarship as sitting at the intersection of social policy, prevention science, and public finance, with a focus on optimizing interventions to promote healthy development and well-being. So that is the dynamic duo. So okay. So the first one, we'll see how this goes. I'm going to let one of you answer this, but for folks listening, I think it's useful to maybe give a brief definition of what the field of prevention science is. One of you can take that.
Yeah, go ahead.
There we go. Okay.
All right. So, well, I think that when we talk about what prevention is, right, and what prevention science is here at Penn State, it's really inspired by very much a public health mentality and this idea that there are underlying risk and protective factors, right, that lead to outcomes we'd like to prevent. And the process of identifying and understanding those and then intervening with them, that's really the science of prevention, right? Just like we know there's underlying risk factors for heart disease, right? And we do things to try to mitigate and prevent those. We do that, but we do that with things like substance use, right? Or child maltreatment, or issues related to homelessness and family destabilization. These are the opportunities that prevention science really the lens that it brings us. And, here at Penn State, we've been doing it better than everyone, I would say, for a while now.
So I had a little bit of that because in fact, when I came here, the center's name was the Prevention Research Center for the Promotion of Well-Being. And so it's both prevention and promotion. We want to prevent problems like child maltreatment or aggressive behavior or drug use, but we want to promote the well-being of people. And those two go hand in hand because when you do the right developmental things to help people move on the pathways towards well-being, you also prevent problem behaviors at the same time. It's a twofer.
Yeah, 100%. I think you alluded, I think some of the remarks that I heard either yesterday or today, there was an allusion to the fact that a lot of what we do in the science of health and well-being actually is scoped on focusing on the adverse outcomes instead of being focused on what we can do to promote the positive outcomes.
Right.
That's great.
Yeah.
All right. So we've heard a little bit about what prevention science is. And Max, you alluded to a little bit of the fact that prevention is sort of a universal principle in public health, but here at Penn State, we sort of bring a focus to some of these behavioral health problems, quality of life problems. So prevention science is considered sort of a subfield of psychology, and I know both of you have backgrounds in psychology. So I want to hear from each of you now, kind of how you wandered into this subfield of prevention science. And maybe Mark, we'll start with you.
Great. Well, I was trained as a child clinical psychologist, and I did some treatment with kids and families. But I realized early on that treating one child at a time would never reduce the rate of problems or disorders in our society. That the only way to do that is to move upstream and say, what are the, as Max said, risk and protective factors, or what are the promotive factors that we can give families and children from infancy on, even prenatally, that will lead them not to have these disorders in the first place. Because if I treat one child at a time, we're never going to reduce the number of children that have those problems.
Right.
Well, it's possible that there are siblings, there may be a small effect, but for the most part, while we want to treat people that already have problems, we're not going to improve the quality of society only by doing that.
Yeah.
And that's the basis of public health in general, which is, a couple hundred years old. And really, I've always seen myself as a public health scientist, not a psychologist.
Oh, interesting. So a little bit. So was there a mentor, or how'd you kind of make that transition? I mean, what was the catalyst? Let's get a little personal here, Mark.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you how it happened. Really, I was doing my clinical training in a rural hospital in Virginia, in Charlottesville, Virginia, and it served the entire region of Southwest Virginia, much of it very rural. And kids were coming in, and I was seeing them under supervision, of course. And my supervisor said to me the night before, he said, there's a deaf child coming in tomorrow, and you're going to see her. She's 5 years old. We think she's schizophrenic. And he handed me a test, and he said, learn this test tonight. Okay. Now, I was trained by a very famous woman named Mary Ainsworth, who developed attachment theory in America. And so I was very interested in attachment processes. And the next morning, this little girl who had driven 3 hours with her mother, she didn't know where she was, and I were in a room. I said to the mother and her, we're going to play some games. Can you wait in the waiting room? And so the mother said this. She put up her finger and said, I'm leaving. Now, this little girl didn't know if she was leaving for a minute, an hour, or leaving her daughter there.
Yeah.
Right. And of course, the little girl just freaked out completely, banging on the door, trying to get out. Of course, I was successful in engaging her in the toys and the games, and we played. But I saw how disordered her attachment was, and the fact that her mother couldn't communicate with her at 5 years of age. I ran to the library back then with the Dewey Decimal System, no computers. And I looked up all the research that had been done on deaf children, and so there was nothing existed. There had never been a study of the attachment processes of families with deaf children. And that was the start, because then I began to realize that deaf children were diagnosed with all kinds of disorders that they didn't have because no one understood them. And it is because they weren't taught the fundamental basic developmental skills that make us all healthy.
Yeah.
And so I began to try to develop a curriculum, first in sign language and speech with deaf children to try to improve their well-being. And that was the first attempt I had in prevention, and that curriculum now, of course, is used with all kinds of children, is used in, well, more than 1 million children have been.
So this was the foundation.
This is the foundation of the past
Did
curriculum.
not
So it
know.
was clinical work that led
Yeah.
me to say, wow, this is a problem that if you look upstream, you can prevent this.
Yeah.
And in fact, that's what we showed. We showed in randomized trials with deaf kids and of course with hearing kids that if we give kids the skills to understand themselves, to regulate their behavior, to understand others, to be empathic and caring, that in fact, that's what they become.
Great story. Thank you for sharing that. Now,
Yeah.
Max, how about you? You studied psychology as an undergrad?
I did study psychology and sociology as well. And, for me, it was a different path and a different time, right? So by the time I was sort of this area, I was an undergrad, and I did some work replicating an ethnography in the Caribbean on this island called Dominica, which was some work that famous researcher Ann Maston had done around resilience, looking at parental conceptions, basically of competence, right, in their kids, or parental competencies as well as their parents' perceptions of their own child's competencies. And it was fascinating, right, because it was a different country doing this work, right, really trying to understand, a different culture in the ways that folks were interacting. And it was an amazing experience, but it also really revealed to me probably in a similar way, the pathways through which kids, right, grow up and go off into the world and how formative that time was. So I became very passionate and read as an undergrad about prevention science, all these things. So in that point, right, when Mark was coming up, there was no really the definition. It was no field.
Yeah.
I had the benefit of coming into a space where there was a field and there was many interventions. Right?
Yeah.
So when I applied, right, to Penn State, it was because Penn State is and was a leader in the field of prevention science. But what I didn't know I was going to get when I came to Penn State is that the field was very different, right? So at the time when Mark was coming up, we had a total dearth, right, of preventative interventions, right? But Mark and his colleagues created these incredible evidence-based strategies and solutions. And the problem facing the field when I got there was a lot less about can we create interventions, it's can we get people to use them, right? Can we get communities, right, to use them? Can we find ways to put these in the hands of people who can actually help kids? And so I had a very different, I think, experience at that point because I've thought a lot about issues of the infrastructure that's required, right? How do we support communities? How do we support healthcare systems, child welfare systems, right? How do we actually think about public policy that supports a prevention orientation versus the same sort of issue of just waiting, right, until the terrible thing happens?
Yeah.
And then maybe even more so, could we actually orient folks towards this idea of flourishing, this idea of compassion, right? This idea that we can actually strive for more than just the absence of the problem, but actually, the amazing experiences of what it means to be human.
Fantastic. Well, thank you. So I got to get this out of the way.
Uh-oh.
So on deck, question on deck, we're gonna need to hear the origin story of the PRC. So that's on deck, but I got to do this one too. So what was your favorite thing about Mark as a professor?
Ooh. It's an interesting one because it's a little personal, but that's what this is about, right, Greg? So Mark was, an eminent scientist by the time. I was probably one of towards the end of your students, for sure. And so super intimidating. And I didn't really know how academia worked, right? And I was here maybe a week, maybe
If you
2 weeks.
figure it out, let me know.
I know, right? Yeah, I'm still figuring it out, but I didn't even know how an assistantship worked, right, for graduate school. And so I kind of showed up and, was on an assistantship, and I said, like, all right, Mark, like, what do I need to do? Like, do I need to start applying for grants or like go find a fellowship or things like that? And Mark said to me, he said, you really don't need to worry about where your money's coming from for the next 4 or 5 years, right? We have this incredible center, this endowment, these supports. like, we'll figure it out. And that was the first time anyone in my life had said to me, you don't need to worry about money. You don't need to worry about resources. And so, Mark is a brilliant scientist, but I think the biggest thing is that Mark is a kind person and gave me the security I needed to grow as a professional.
Yeah.
So
And the PRC is, that legacy goes on as the PRC is.
Very
growing.
much.
So many
Very much.
students. Got to ask the flip question. What was your favorite thing about
I don't know if he has one.
Well, first of all, Max is incredibly brilliant. He's one of the smartest people I've ever met. And that was apparent from the beginning. And so I realized all I had to do was sort of point Max in a direction. And he almost needed and didn't need supervision in a way. But there was two qualities of him I think that were important. One, he really wanted to work to help people. But he also came with this incredible ideas about economics and how economics and cost benefit and understanding how we can convince policymakers that money could be saved by doing these preventive interventions, brought a completely new dimension to the prevention center that, of course, over the last 20 years has become incredibly important to the center's growth.
Yeah, 100%. Obviously, I've been converted. If you remember my comments this morning, I think that the impact of the center, the impact that the center can make in that space is probably even greater than it can doing some of the traditional work, which needs to continue
Absolutely.
as well.
Absolutely.
All right, so now we're at it. So let's hear the origin story of the prevention.
So I was a full professor at the University of Washington. I had lots of grant money. I was doing really interesting stuff, I thought. And Penn State contacted me because they were going to do something in the area of intervention and prevention. And I had done 20 years of research doing randomized trials funded by NIH, proving that preventive interventions worked. But when I went back to the schools or the communities 2 or 3 years after the trial was done, even though the findings showed that there were important impacts, and those settings knew this, it was gone. That unless we were there with them all the time doing sustainable technical assistance, that it wasn't going to work. And that made me think, well, and all the money we did was funded by grants from research. And yet there's billions of dollars every day spent on health and welfare for children and families in America. And I didn't understand how any of it worked. So I wanted to move from the sort of the basic randomized trials, although of course I continue to still do them, to understanding how government works, how technical assistance works, how government agencies work, how legislatures think about these things. And when I proposed this to Penn State, not only to come as the endowed professor in prevention, but to start a center. And I wrote out an idea of this. And I went to the loving, incredible Edna Bennett Pierce. She looked at this and she said, yes, you can do this. And in my negotiation with the university, they gave me a building in Harrisburg right across from the Capitol, right across from the legislature. And I spent, in the first year or two, I spent as much time in Harrisburg as I did here at State College, building what we call the University Children's Policy Collaborative with Pitt and Temple. And what we did is we went to government agencies, the director of Bureau of Maternal and Child Health or the et cetera. And we said, what's the problem you have right now? What do you want to know about? And we supplied information to them. And that then turned into a very large $5 million one-year project, which was the beginning of sort of early childhood education here in Pennsylvania. Because when I came here, Pennsylvania was one of only 8 states in the country that did not fund early childhood education. And it was when Governor Ridge went to become the Homeland Security Director, Governor Schweikert only decided to be the governor for 1 year because he had little children. He didn't want to run for the governor. He thought he could do one thing in the year, and that was to build early childhood in Pennsylvania. And I was lucky to be there at the right time, and with Mr. Rogers. And we did this work. And so while we were doing lots of stuff at Penn State, building training programs and working with graduate students and doing randomized trials, my real goal in coming here was to understand not just that stuff, but the next frontier, which was, how does this actually work? How does government actually decide to do or not do preventive interventions? What are the challenges and the obstacles? And then Max comes with these ideas about cost and benefit and policy. So you could see how we
Yeah,
were
see how
a
that
perfect
connected.
match for each other.
So you mentioned Edna, and I had the pleasure of meeting Edna. So did you knew Edna before you came to I'm not sure I know
Well,
what their
they
history
offered
is
me
there.
the job, and I said that I didn't want to take the job until I went and met with Edna.
Okay.
The idea of a living donor philanthropist who you could actually understand why they were doing this, what their needs were, why they were interested in this seems so important to me. So before I accepted the job, I went to Delaware and met with Edna, and I thought I need to get to know her as a person and understand why she's doing this, to understand what my position would really be. And she had worked in her church in Wilmington, working with families around food insecurity and homelessness. And that's how she became interested in not just building the playground, when she built the first playground in our old building,
Right.
but she began to think about really what does it mean for Penn State to take an active public role in promoting well-being for children.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean,
Yeah.
really an incredible example of engaged philanthropy and sort of a partnership between an academic and a philanthropist.
Yeah.
And you don't see that a lot, but obviously she was instrumental to the launch and the growth of the center, and is sorely missed. All right, so let's why don't we do the projects, the initiatives that have come out of the PRC are manifold. Why don't each of you pick? This is probably gonna be hard too. All my questions are hard. Pick one particular initiative. It could be historical. It could be current, that you think really is I don't know, holds some special significance, either because of the impact or because of the the partnerships that you had to build to make it happen. Just give us one more specific example of an initiative like that. And why don't you go first, Max, since we had Mark tell him the origin story.
I'm gonna let Mark do this first, because he has so many different ones that he
Sure.
seeded,
Okay.
and then I have a more future forward.
Maybe I'll talk about peace.
Okay,
Peace
great,
initiative.
fantastic.
So, I was always interested in awareness, because my interest really was in how people come to regulate their emotions, because people that can regulate their emotions well just do better in everything. It's the goal of the realm, really, to be able to do that. And when you work in schools, you see these kids lined up in the principal's office, it's not because of their IQ or their
Yeah.
achievement ability. It's because they can't regulate themselves, and they hurt other kids. They say mean things to teachers. They get in trouble on the playground. It's all about emotion regulation, which is completely separate from intelligence, right? And so I was always interested in emotion regulation. And in 2000, I was invited to a meeting in Dharamsala with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And then many meetings after that with him over time in the public. And as part of that, I had been thinking about not just preventing problems, but really how do you promote well-being? And I was particularly interested in not just the well-being of children, but teachers, because if teachers aren't well, then kids don't learn and schools don't operate well. And before that time, if you sent a grant to the National Institute of Health on something like mindfulness or compassion, you'd just be laughed out of the peer review. You wouldn't get funded.
Right, sure.
And I and a couple other colleagues sort of what I call broke the glass ceiling on that area. We began to actually convince reviewers that this was important. An example was we already had a family-based curriculum that we're using here at Penn State called the Strengthening Families Program. But I thought the program could be much better. And I had colleagues, Larissa Duncan, a graduate student, and Doug Cosworth, a faculty member. And we thought, let's build out a mindful version, a more deep, compassionate version of the same program for parents of teenagers. And if there's any time you need to be compassionate, it's when you have teenagers. And so we convinced the government to give us a randomized trial. We had a randomized control group, strengthening families, as has always been done, which is evidence-based, but then a mindful version, right? And that's with the beginning of the idea that we could integrate compassion and mindfulness into already existing good quality interventions. And that led to the Peace Initiative, promoting awareness and compassion in education. And Edna, for example, loved this idea so much that, of course, she endowed 3 new chairs in compassion. And the idea that an idea like compassion could be legitimate at a university is really a new idea.
Yeah.
And if I had proposed this 30 years ago, people would have thought I was really losing my marbles, right?
But now there's a network of
But now there's a
universities
network
that
of
are-
universities that have compassion centers, and we realize that if we want to have the kind of society that we all yearn for, we've got to actually promote these abilities.
Yeah. Well, so before I turn to you, Max, one of the questions that we got in advance was someone was wondering about anything that you're doing currently with His Holiness. But I want to ask, you know, you told that story and you just sort of said, well, yeah, and I was invited to a meeting with His Holiness. How did that come about? Because that's not something that a lot of people can sort of say. And
Yeah.
you pointed to that as kind of the catalyst for this work, but what got you there in the first place?
Yeah, I think what got me there is there's a foundation called the Mind and Life Foundation that was developed to serve His Holiness in the sense of His Holiness was always interested in science. In fact, even as a child, he took apart clocks and put them back together. The previous Dalai Lama had been given a car, but there was no roads in Lhasa, and so he actually took the car apart and put it back together when he was a kid. So he's always interested in how things worked. And when he was exiled, he was also interested in quantum physics and all kinds of areas in science. And so this foundation was set up to inform him about scientific issues. And as he said in his own books, if Buddhism does not align with science, we need to change Buddhism to align with what we know about science. Okay, really modernization in a way. And Daniel Goleman, who many of you probably know about, who's written many books on emotional intelligence, was the psychology editor for the New York Times at the time, and he had written an article about my work in the New York Times in the mid-90s, and he was organizing this meeting.
Okay.
Because he had a long-term relationship
Yeah.
with the Dalai Lama.
That's amazing.
And so he invited me. In fact, to go to the meeting, you just don't walk in and start talking to His Holiness. We had a 3-day meeting 3 months beforehand to plan what we were going to say. And I had this whole presentation, Craig. It was like, I thought it was really good. And I practiced it in front of a group of people that had presented before to the Dalai Lama, and they deconstructed the entire presentation because I was using idioms and metaphors and all kinds of things that wouldn't cross culture.
Yeah.
So then I actually prepared my presentation, and I presented it to 3 or 4 different audiences, all getting ready, and I had beautiful photos, etc. And now we're in Dharamsala, and we're in these are 5-day-long meetings. And after the first 2 days, which were about sort of the philosophy of well-being and emotions, etc., Dan Goleman came to me and said, I don't want you to give your talk. He said, I just want you to sit next to the Dalai Lama and tell him about what you do with children.
Yeah.
And so I had him do, for example, I had him practice doing turtle, which is what we teach 4 and 5-year-olds to do, which is to hold your hands like this, where you can't be getting into trouble.
Yeah.
And you can also say to yourself, I'm mad, right? Instead of acting it out. Or with deaf children, we'd have them sign the turtle again. And His Holiness got up and did the turtle with me. And Richard Gere was in the audience. And Richard Gere turned to me at the break and showed me a picture of the Buddha, where the Buddha's doing this. You see, it's because self-control, as you said, emotion regulation, self-control is fundamental to human experience.
Yeah.
We're all working on it all the time, right? I confess I'm still not very good at it.
We're all working on it. That's amazing. So Max, and yours does not have to include either Richard Gere
No
or
celebrities
the Dalai Lama.
So we
initiative?
had our speaker this week, Dr. Keltner,
who's fantastic.
was fantastic, and he spoke about all these amazing things and like informing the Inside Out movie, and and then Mark over here with the Dalai Lama and Richard Gere. I have none of those. So, but I do have an answer to the original question of some of the incredible work, right, that is being done at the center, and I think it does involve people that can make decisions. And I think that's really important. So in 2008, the center, the PRC, in a partnership, and I'm not going to get the full story on this, but basically this idea that there's, as Mark said, like I kind of came in and I was already, I don't want to say obsessed, but pretty interested in how resources are spent, right? Public resources, and how a lot of resources go out, and do they really help people, right? And how do we create systems and strategies and approaches that actually increase that accountability of how public resources are spent so that we get the biggest bang for our buck, for lack of a better word, right? And there, were lots of evidence-based programs, and some communities were trying to use them, but when they try to use them and they were using public dollars to implement them, it doesn't always go great, right? They can be very technically difficult. They require training. There's all sorts of things that happen, right, along the way. But the PRC had developed these strategies for providing technical assistance, right, for how you deliver evidence-based strategies. And in a partnership and with support from the Commonwealth, they set up something called EPIS, the Evidence-Based Prevention
Intervention
Support, right? Good, got it. And an incredible model of how, when a community gets resources from the Commonwealth, right, they are actually able to access and receive, and it's actually required, right, to get this technical assistance and have the monitoring that makes sure that those public resources are being used in the way that they're intended to help kids and children and families.
And that gets back to what Mark was saying about when scientists come in and do things that are research funded, if there's nothing to sustain it, it goes away.
And part of sustainability is that you're doing it well and that the people are benefiting from it. And so that is like really when I talk about, I came in a different time, right? This infrastructure, how do we build, right, these strategies that actually are good stewards of public resources and honestly hold government and those who receive public resources accountable in a way that actually achieves our goals was incredibly compelling to me. Yeah. And, as I think about the future, one of the things I'm really excited about is Mark mentioned, like, I have this keen interest in how policymakers, right? Policymakers create context, they hold the purse strings, they do all the things. And I was incredibly inspired by things like EPIS and this technical support system, and thinking about, well, how to create the evidence that this in fact works, right? And how do we actually think about ultimately how we get policymakers to recognize there are evidence-based strategies that work out there, and if they're going to deploy public resources, how to do it in the right way. And that led to a lot of our work with different policy communities, including Mark's sort of comment around, 20 years ago, if he'd walked in and tried to propose, doing work studying compassion to the National Institutes of Health, they would have laughed him out of the room. The same kind of journey I've been on is we want to study policymakers. We want to understand how to get them to use the science if we're going to invest public resources. And now, recently this year, we started a new NIH-funded trial where we're randomizing legislative bodies, 30 legislative bodies in the country that actually provide the evidence to them and support their use of it so that we can see see public resources being stewarded in ways that work, right? And it's a simple idea, but at the end of the day, it's kind of the fundamental thing. If we want to keep putting public resources into things, we have to be good stewards of it. So
and this is another reason why I came to Penn State, because it was a land grant university.
Right. Yep.
And I got a clear message from the president and the provost that they wanted to better fulfill their role as a land grant university, which is really to serve the state and to help the state do things more effectively.
Yeah.
What a beautiful mission.
I mean, I think, and that's why I'm here, right? So Mark recruited me from Duke University, and I grew up actually in North Carolina. Always had a lot of respect for Duke, but it's a private institution, and the mission of Penn State is incredibly compelling, right? We are here to serve, and we are here to provide value back to the communities, and that includes the research enterprise, that includes the PRC, and that's really what I've been particularly excited about in getting to take on this role beginning this year. Has been the PRC has a history of service, right? And we are looking for ways to serve, and we're going to continue that work and find new ways. It's just really incredible. So
fantastic. All right. Well, I got a bunch more questions, but I don't know, Brent, has anything come in yet? All right. So don't be shy. This is my time to remind you that if you've got something that you want to ask, you can put it in the Q&A feature. But otherwise, I'll go ahead. So I'll pivot. This is I love to ask fellow researchers this question. It's a tough one, so if you want to take the pass, you can take the pass. But has there in the arc of your career, and Mark, yours is a little longer than Max's, but Max has done plenty of work. Has there been Can you recall a story? And I think that folks who aren't scientists love to hear these kinds of stories, where you went into a situation with like with an a priori hypothesis, as we tend to do.
Yeah.
And you were wrong.
Yeah.
And it sort of changed the trajectory of the work that you were doing.
Yeah, in fact, there's one recent one.
Okay.
I'm an investigator in what's called the Myriad Project. It's actually based out of the University of Oxford in England, and it's a randomized trial of 84 secondary, what we call middle schools,
Sure.
in the UK. And the randomized trial was to test the effectiveness of a mindfulness program for 11 and 12-year-olds, supposedly to improve reduce their depression, anxiety, improve their well-being, etc., their attention, maybe their engagement in school, their peer relationships. It was a very well-conducted trial. It was very expensively funded by the Wellcome Trust in the UK, and it had no effect at all. None. So that's a comeuppance.
Yeah.
And so then always the question in a randomized trial when it doesn't work is why?
Yeah.
And unless you've done good qualitative work inside that trial to actually be talking to people all the time, it's very hard to know, because you can generate 4, 5, 6 hypotheses. It wasn't long enough. The curriculum wasn't right. People weren't trained well enough.
Right.
It's the wrong
Poor
developmental
fidelity.
period.
Yeah.
Our measures weren't good
Yeah.
enough, etc. But it really leads me to something that I've been involved in my whole career, which is really the development of social emotional learning in schools. And we know for the most part that short programs don't have much impact. While it'd be great if a short dose of something could really change the way children or schools act, you got to be in it for the long run. And we know that curriculums that are longer, that are more involved, that get teachers more involved, that help them integrate across the curriculum, not just during the mindfulness time, but how do you use your mindfulness to be better when you're taking a test, or how do you use your mindfulness to think about political problems that we now all face. And so this is a great comeuppance, because the project was very expensive. Everybody who was short was going to work, and it had no effects, and we have to respect the findings.
Yeah. And so the post hoc analysis, the working hypothesis now is that it was duration of intervention.
Duration and maybe age. That actually in the qualitative work, we found that about half the early teens didn't like doing this.
Okay.
They didn't think it was fun.
Yeah.
And that's important. Having the youth voice in our interventions, especially as kids get older, are really important, because if they're not motivated by the intervention, well, it's probably not going to work.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Do you have an into trenches story like that?
Yeah, I've it's sort of an interesting one, because it really shows the assumptions and where we sometimes make the wrong investment. So we do this thing, and many of you out there who might be coming from marketing spaces and things like this will sound really familiar, but for those of you who just have an email account and you get 1,000 different marketing messages every day, right? What a lot of people don't know is that underneath those are randomized trials, right? So marketers, right, are often playing with the subject line, and they randomize and they send it out to half and half and see if it gets you to click on it, open the email, all that stuff. You see it a lot with political campaigns too, right? They're trying to get that donation, and they're always playing with the language, and they're running trials on us. Well, we decided to flip the script, and we started running those type of what they're called as AB trials, marketing trials, functionally science communication trials on policymakers. And so we have done over 100 of these, where we randomize different types of science communication, how to get basically policymakers to engage with science, right? And other ways to do it. We've had some interesting findings, right, around how you convey information, and one word in the subject line can change whether or not they open the brief and read and do all this stuff. It's really cool. But there was one that I was like, oh, this is we just need to do it to say we do it. And we used to create these amazing, beautiful, newsletter style emails, right?
Yeah.
They're all formatted pretty. All of y'all get them.
Sure,
We
sure.
the PRC, we send these things out too, right?
Don't worry about that too.
But we randomized it against an email that looked like, an academic dashed it off in the middle of the night, right? Because they had an idea.
Furrier typeface.
Furrier typeface, a couple typos in
Yeah.
it, right? And what we found is that dashed off email got opened, got the contents got looked at and interacted with, and the links got clicked on, and we got more responses back, right, from that quick dashed off, email versus the thing that took a lot of time and effort, right, to create. And I was like, wow, like, okay, well, we were definitely putting our time and effort into the wrong thing there. And this was in very much to the credit of my colleague in this work, Taylor Scott, and her team. Like, we uncovered this sort of really fundamental thing that has changed how we invest, right? Because the reality is it was ultimately more authentic.
Yeah,
right.
Right.
And we all get these really flashy things. So those kind of things those discoveries are the things that sort of make being a scientist so much fun, right? I mean,
absolutely.
they can be hard to swallow
Yeah,
sometimes,
Yeah.
but yeah, so that's sort of one of ours. Yeah.
Appreciate it. All right, so we've got a couple questions
Yeah,
coming
great.
in. I want to leave one of them sort of for the closer, but I like the idea, we're talking about the PRC, so and when we definitely want to keep our focus there. And we alluded a little bit more to sort of the network of institutions that are now involved in the type of interventions the PEACE program is interested in. But so the PRC, are there other, I'm going to want to give too much airtime to our competitors, but are there other universities that have made these kinds of investments, and who are some of the other leaders in the field of prevention?
I mean,
science?
we're certainly not the only,
Sure.
and but what's really interesting is a lot of them are led by our trainees, right? So many of our trainees have gone out in so Nate
pretty cool.
Riggs, right, at Colorado, right, Brittany Cooper, right, at Washington State, and Michael Cleveland, who's also out there, Mildred Maldonado down in I believe she's at Miami, right?
Yeah, Florida.
Florida. I don't know, I'm sure I'm missing some others,
Yeah.
but it's really incredible, right? So what we've seen is the growth of a field, right? And so there are others out there.
But I should say, most of these centers
Mhm.
began with center grants from the National Institute of Mental Health, the National Institute of Drug Abuse. And when you get money from the government, you get 5 years, maybe you get renewed for 10 years, maybe you get renewed for 15 years. But a lot of those have disappeared. And why we stay is because of the endowment, as well as your commitment, Craig, as a dean, that this is central to what health and human development's about. That the university has invested, the university has gotten alumni excited, and we have a whole bunch of alumni that have been excited. They come to our meetings, they invest in our programs, and that's what made the difference, because we could have been one of these 5 or 10 year centers.
Right.
But because of endowment, we are here forever.
Yeah. No, indeed.
And that means we can continue to grow and evolve in ways that no one else can, because when you have this endowment support, you can think in a way that's not just about the present, but where you want to be 5 or 10 years from now. In a way that you're not just responding to what the government wants to do, but you're thinking, what is it we should really be doing?
Sort of builds in resilience for a research center is what is really.
That's exactly right. I mean, the funding, trends and climates change, right? Focuses change, and we've grown to meet those, right? The endowment is not the only thing, of course, that supports our work. We're really successful, but we're not successful in spite of, it's because, right? Because of these investments, these legacy supports that we've received. And I think that is, Mark is totally right. Like, while there's prevention centers, like the CDC also funds these 3 years, and they pop up and they go away, right? But when you think about how big impact, right, is really created, it takes time, right? It takes time and it takes investment, and that's the amazing element. And the reason we have our trainees who've gone out and shaped the field is because we've had that continuous culture that is not just focused on the aims of a singular grant, right, but is about leading the field, and that's what's been, I mean, just makes us so unique.
No, that's fantastic. So you mentioned the alumni network, and I promise we're gonna the question I'm going to close with. I'm going to make sure that I ask Max and Mark about ways that alumni or anybody who's watching today can connect to the PRC and can get involved. But I'm going to leave that for my closer. I want to because there's something I wanted to ask, and there's a little bit more of a basic question here, but just maybe just take a second, Max. There was somebody asked, just how many faculty are associated with the center, and you can talk a little bit about affiliated faculty and staff. Just how big is the operation? Because I'm certainly aware of that, but it might be good to just give a little bit more descriptives.
Definitely. I mean, so we have a core group of our research faculty, our staff, right, our trainees. which is honestly close to about 100, right? And that's not just here in State College. We have folks working all over the country remotely, and that's been one of actually the wonderful things over the last few years is it's let us have more presence locally in communities, right? Because of all of the different opportunities for workflow and telecommunications. So that's been really cool. But beyond, right, those who are within the PRC are our faculty affiliates, which are an incredible, incredible resource. So this includes, I think we're something like 40 faculty affiliates almost within the College of Health and Human Development, but we don't really draw the boundaries there, right? We have folks and faculty from all over the university, as well as from the college here at University Park, College of Medicine, as well as the campuses that affiliate and do work with us and that we collaborate on. And so that's what's been incredibly powerful is we're a catalyst, right?
Yeah.
What Mark built, what Edna has supported, and others as well is a catalyst for community. And at this point, at this moment in time in society and higher education, that community is just incredible. So,
Yeah. And that's a perfect tee off to the question that I want to ask. I want to talk a little bit about some of the collaborations. So, you know, we've talked about prevention science as sort of being a subdiscipline of psychology. We've talked about its roots and connections to public health. I know that you know, knowing a little bit about the array of projects that the PRC has been involved with over the years, I know that there's been some collaborations maybe with colleagues from fields that you might not, you know, initially associate as being involved in prevention science. So maybe if you could talk about a collaboration, kind of an interesting collaboration that brought you or one of your colleagues at the time in contact with somebody from another field and how that worked, what that was about.
do you have one in
Well, I
mind?
can give one,
Yeah.
which is we have a very large, two very large projects that are longitudinal projects, Fast Track and Prosper, which have been going on for about 25 years. So we started with children when they were 6 years old, and they're 36. Max has been involved with that one. Prosper started with kids at 11, and now they're 32. We became interested in how genes might interact with preventive interventions. And so working with people in biobehavioral health, one of the great departments in our college, we collected genetic data, and we actually have published a series of papers that shows that certain genes that are, for example, risk genes for alcohol use, when kids have them, the preventive interventions have more impact on them than kids that don't have those risk genes. And so it's an example where you might think, oh, we're just interested in changing behavior, but we're really interested in understanding the roots of all this. From really, as we say, from neurons to neighborhoods.
Great. You got one more?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think there's a number that come to mind. I mean, within the college, like we have great recreation parks and tourism as a department. And so, like, for instance, we have a faculty member who studies circus work, youth circus work, right? And we have a new collaboration there. I'm so excited about Jen Agins. We, you know, work with outside with labor and industry and with SMEAL to think about business connections, right? And I think that's been another really exciting one. So one line of work that's been led by Meg Small has been our partnership with the NASDAQ Entrepreneurial Center, supported by JP Morgan and Wells Fargo, right? These big heavy hitters in the business space who are thinking about how do we support entrepreneurs, right? How do we support entrepreneurs from a human development perspective, right? How do we support entrepreneurship as actually a way of breaking intergenerational cycles of poverty by giving people control of their finances and creating family businesses? And like, that's something that I would have never thought about, you know, but, you know, originally we have so much to offer, right, in the business space. And we've talked a lot about public health, but economic stability is a huge part of it, right? 100%. And the partnerships with business, with industry are huge.
Yeah, great, fantastic examples. All right, so we've talked, you know, historically about some of the great impact. We talked a little bit about some of the projects that are ongoing and forward-looking. There's a lot to be excited about. I want to ask, you know, what you think some of the challenges are. What do you think the biggest challenges for the field of prevention science moving forward? Because it's not all free-flowing dollars and rose petals. What are some of the challenges or the biggest one that you think is out there?
Well, I think that there's a real question around, like, still around how do we translate, right? How do we get this work out into the world, right? And I think a big part of that is it comes through our students, right? And how we engage with our students, how we support our students in this space, right? How do we give them the space to, for instance, engage in such an interdisciplinary topic as prevention science?
Yeah.
And how do we create a workforce, right, of preventionists, right, and flourishing specialists? I think that that is a tremendous challenge facing the field, facing the prevention center, is how do we create the workforce that can take these programs forward and create the identity, right, amongst our students to be in that space. So that's a big one for us. I think the other is, you know, scientists sometimes we don't necessarily think about the role of industry, right, in getting our innovation out into the world, especially social scientists, right? You know, you know, our folks in biology and doing pharmaceutical work, they have a natural kind of partner in those spaces. And I think that we're really at an inflection point that for us to achieve the biggest impact, we have to reach people where they are, which is in the workplace, right? We have to reach people, you know, through not just as individuals, but through the organizations in which they are connected to. And your job is often the biggest of those, right? Or one of the main ones. And so I think that that is a tremendous challenge, but we need the experience and expertise, the lived kind of experience, if you will, of folks within industry to kind of partner with us so that we can understand what the needs are, right? We can understand how to create something that not what we think should work, but is actually designed for the user. Right? And so I think those are tremendous challenges ahead of us. So.
Anything to add, Mark?
Yeah, I think really different challenges. One is that I think in prevention, we've been able to prove that we can improve people's well-being. We can reduce aggression. We can reduce the rates of depression and those kinds of things. But what we haven't done well yet is the health outcomes. Okay, so for example, it doesn't. I don't think it's not hard to convince someone that if children learn to regulate their emotions well and parents learn to regulate their emotions well, we're going to have children that have fewer injuries. We're going to have children spend less time in emergency rooms. We're going to have less time in nurses' offices. But as they grow older, they're going to make better decisions in both, not just drug and alcohol use, which we know, but also in relation to obesity and how they decide to eat. They're going to form relationships in different ways that we know that the quality of relationships affects our morbidity. But we haven't made the ties yet as directly as we can between preventive interventions that are in the area of mental health and behavior with health outcomes. And this is a really key one.
Yeah, so a challenge, but an opportunity there too for future research.
And the last one is climate. There's the climate crisis. I think that we have a lot we can do to do new research that would help to indicate how we can help people manage the process of the climate crisis. So right now we have climate anxiety at very high rates, not only in adults, but in teens. And if young people feel that it's hopeless to try to make the changes, we won't be able to make them. But it's these social emotional skills. It's empowering kids with these skills of how to work together, how to understand and have empathy for people who have different perspectives, how to resolve conflict, how to take action in the public arena that are really going to be important. And so unless we empower people, not just with knowledge about the problem of the climate, but with the skills to solve the problem, we're not going to get there. And so I think that preventive interventions have an incredible opportunity here to really work with the issue of the world's biggest problem, which is climate.
And you know, it's a great teaser. You know, as Max knows, and you may know, Mark, the college has launched a program area initiative in the area of environmental health sciences. And you know, maybe we'll have a future coffee with Craig on our environmental health sciences initiative. But I mean, I can see some, you know, really salient partnerships between the Prevention Research Center and some of the environmental health scientists that we're going to be bringing in, because we have highlighted the intersection of climate and health as a priority for those recruitments. So that's really exciting. All right, so we're getting close to time, so we're at the point where I'm going to formally ask the question. We've previewed a couple of times. If folks who are watching, listening, are interested in connecting with the PRC, if they're wondering about ways, for our alums that they can get engaged, what are some of the things that you would suggest folks do to follow up?
Definitely. Well, I'd love to hear from you just to start with. So please feel free to send me a personal email. I think that'll be disseminated along with this. So that's the first thing. But we also are engaging in a couple different ways that we'd really like to hear from our alum, right? We'd love to honestly tap your experience, your knowledge about not only your time here at Penn State, but also about the experience that you've gone out as you've been out in the world in your profession. Specifically, like we're launching a series of focus groups because we, as you can hear, do have pressing questions, right? Questions that really can't be answered without our alum, right? Without our alum who've worked in a variety of different areas and different sectors, right? Who've had different types of life experience, family experience. These are really important to us. We want to hear from you. And so we'll be announcing some of these focus groups. And if you're interested in being involved, please let us know. But just as a teaser, one thing, for instance, is some of the curriculum here that we want to facilitate our departments and the college developing in the prevention, in the flourishing space, right? This sort of idea of how do we kind of arm our students with the skills so they can go into organizations and they can be leaders, right? As we think about wellness, as we think about how to support in human resources, as we think about how to develop portfolios of evidence-based programs. And so we're really interested in some of that curriculum development and engaging our alumni around that. We also have some other opportunities in terms of some of the work, for instance, of workplace interventions themselves, right? And we're looking for partners who would be interested in being part of these focus groups as we do some initial testing, as we engage in some of these listening sessions, but then also in being advisors as we move forward with large trials and partnering with different industries. So this is some really exciting areas that we are really hoping to make those connections around. But I'm also happy to hear from you if you have questions about the field, questions about where we're going, how we're engaging with students, and how we want to work with alumni. Please let me know. So.
And Max is easy to find. You can Google Max Crowley, PRC, HHD, PSU, and you'll find him.
Yep.
And on the focus groups, can I?
Please.
I assume that you'll have something on sort of the homepage for the PRC.
We'll be
once they're
launching something
announced.
very soon, and we'll also, as I said, we will be reaching out through some other channels as well to make sure folks know about how they can get involved. We're also, co-creating this. So if there are ideas that emerge through these conversations, through this outreach, we're very excited about bringing together like-minded people for different areas. So super excited to kind of go on this journey with y'all.
Thanks, Max. There are some notes of thanks coming in on the chat. I appreciate that. I know I didn't get to all the questions, but thanks for sending those in. I like to close. Many of the folks who tune in are connected to Penn State, but they don't get back to Happy Valley as frequently as they'd like to. So I always like to ask all the guests, Mark, you're a visitor. What's one of the, when you come back, and I know you come back fairly often, what's one of the things that you look forward to doing when you're back in the State College?
Well, I'm a gardener, and I look forward to just walking around this incredible campus because the gardens are just amazing. And even this time of year, I had to escape for a while and go to the Arboretum to see what's happening.
Yeah.
Because the way this university is so lovely as an environment is just, it's really a treasure.
Yeah, we underappreciate it sometimes, being mindful. Like when I'm outside, I try to always pause and look around because it is such a wonderful campus. Well, thanks for sharing that, Max. I know you've got a young family here in State College. What are some of the things that your crew is interested in around and about town?
I mean, I love it. So, and it's a good thing I do because it's clearly the creamery, right? My kids, my 3 and 8 year old, if we're on campus, that's where we're going. So.
Prime creamery.
Yeah. And then the duck pond. So
okay, there you go. 1 and 2
Yep.
recommended for everybody. All right, so we're pretty much at time, I think. So I just want to thank Mark and Mac for joining me, and thank you all for tuning in, and we'll see you next time on the next edition of Coffee with Craig. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Greg.